The changing circumstances of American life, however, soon challenged the rule of those with property. Prominent among the new forces were the rising mercantile and business interests. Where the freehold qualification was applied, businessmen who did not own land were deprived of the vote and excluded from office. In New York, for example, the most illiterate farmer who had £100 worth of land could vote for the state senator and governor, while the landless banker or merchant could not. It is not surprising, therefore, to find businessmen taking the lead in breaking down freehold limitations on the suffrage. The professional classes also were interested in removing the barriers which excluded many of them from public affairs. It was a schoolmaster, Thomas Dorr, who led the popular uprising in Rhode Island, which brought the exclusive rule by freeholders to an end. In addition to the business and professional classes, the mechanics of the town showed a growing hostility to a system of government that generally barred them from voting or holding office. Though not numerous, they had early begun to exercise an influence on the course of public affairs. They had led the riots against the Stamp Act, overturned King George's statute, and, quote, crammed stamps down the throats of collectors, end quote. When the state constitutions were framed, they took a lively interest, particularly in New York City and Philadelphia. In June 1776, the mechanics in Union in New York protested against putting the new state constitution into effect without their approval, declaring that the right to vote on the acceptance or rejection of a fundamental law, quote, is the birthright of every man to whatever state he may belong, end quote. Though their petition was rejected, their spirit remained. When a few years later the federal Constitution was being framed, the mechanics watched the process with deep concern. They knew that one of its main objectives was to promote trade and commerce, affecting directly their daily bread. During the struggle over ratification, they passed resolutions approving its provisions, and they often joined in parades organized to stir up sentiment for the Constitution, even though they could not vote for members of the state conventions and so express their will directly. After the organization of trade unions, they collided with the courts of law and thus became interested in the election of judges and lawmakers. Those who attacked the old system of class rule found a strong moral support in the Declaration of Independence. Was it not said that all men are created equal? Whoever runs may read. Was it not declared that governments derive their just power from the consent of the governed? The doctrine was applied with effect to George III and seemed appropriate for use against the privileged classes of Massachusetts or Virginia. Quote, how do the principles thus proclaimed, asked the non-freeholders of Richmond in petitioning for the state ballot, accord with the existing regulation of the suffrage, a regulation which, instead of the equality nature ordains, creates an odious distinction between members of the same community, and vests in a favored class, not in consideration of their public services, but of their private possessions, the highest of all privileges, end quote. Abolition of property qualifications. By many minor victories rather than by any spectacular triumphs did the advocates of manhood suffrage carry the day. Slight gains were made even during the Revolution or shortly afterward. In Pennsylvania, the mechanics, by taking an active part in the contest over the Constitution of 1776, were able to force the qualification down to the payment of a small tax. Vermont came into the Union in 1792 without any property restrictions. The same year, Delaware gave the vote to all men who paid taxes. Maryland, reckoned one of the most conservative of states, embarked on the experiment of manhood suffrage in 1809. And 9 years later, Connecticut, equally conservative, decided that all taxpayers were worthy of the ballot. 5 states, Massachusetts, New York, Virginia, Rhode Island, and North Carolina, remained obdurate while these changes were going on around them. Finally, they had to yield themselves. The last struggle in Massachusetts took place in the Constitutional Convention of 1820. There, Webster, in the prime of his manhood, and John Adams, in the closing years of his old age, alike protested against such radical innovations as manhood suffrage. Their protests were futile. The property test was abolished, and a small tax-paying qualification was substituted. New York surrendered the next year, and after trying some minor restrictions for 5 years, went completely over to white manhood suffrage in 1826. Rhode Island clung to her freehold qualification through 30 years of agitation. Then Dorr's Rebellion, almost culminating in bloodshed, brought about a reform in 1843, which introduced a slight tax-paying qualification as an alternative to the freehold. Virginia and North Carolina were still unconvinced. The former refused to abandon ownership of land as the test for political rights until 1850, and the latter until 1856. Although religious discrimination and property qualifications for office holders were sometimes retained after the establishment of manhood suffrage, they were usually abolished along with the monopoly of government enjoyed by property owners and taxpayers. At the end of the first quarter of the 19th century, the white male industrial workers and the mechanics of the northern cities at least could lay aside the petition for the ballot and enjoy with the free farmer a voice in the government of their common country. Quote, "Universal democracy," sighed Carlyle, who was widely read in the United States, "whatever we may think of it, has declared itself the inevitable fact of the days in which we live. And he who has any chance to instruct or lead in these days must begin by admitting that, where no government is wanted save that of a parish constable, as in America with its boundless soil, every man being able to find work and recompense for himself, democracy may subsist, not elsewhere." End quote. Amid the grave misgivings of the first generation of statesmen, America was committed to the great adventure. In the populous towns of the East as well as in the forests and fields of the West. The new democracy enters the arena. The spirit of the new order soon had a pronounced effect on the machinery of government and the practice of politics. The enfranchised electors were now long in demanding for themselves a larger share in